Okay, I think we can begin. So, good morning, everyone. Happy to see that a lot of you survived the party yesterday. Hope you had fun with the trucks and everything. Today's session is hopefully dedicated to give you a couple of tips and tricks to just make your apps more amazing. I'm sure it's already very amazing, but we can always add a little bit on top. So that's why I'm calling that spicing up your Android application. So, the title of the talk is Spice Up Tricks, but initially when I started doing that talk, I thought that I would just have 50 or 100 slides with a piece of code on each of the slides, but then I quickly realized it would be kind of boring for you guys. So the first step was to kind of come up with a story, or we could apply these little tricks to make them more interesting for you. So it quickly appeared that just by changing a little bit the title, and instead of having like a general framework, and instead focusing on something that probably every one of you, if you have done Android or even iOS or any other mobile framework have used in your life, probably all of you have used a list view in the past. So we are going to focus on list view. So why list view? As I said, list view is probably the most used widget in the mobile space. Either you have applications like Gmail, which entirely rely on a list view for the main content, or you can also have a very common trait is having an activity, some kind of activity view in your application, which retrace everything that the user has done. Or you can have very specialized, very customized experience like Google Now, where you have, you may think it's like a totally custom experience, but it's just a list view with just very specific items all the time. So these are the kind of default example I could give. But I guess if I wanted to give a better example, I could give YouTube, which if you are like me and like to watch educational video on there, it's probably a good example. But actually, I want you to bring your attention on that. Like I was searching for that yesterday, and I couldn't help but notice that there are still people who think that cats can be something as just a funny animal that's jumping around. So that's a list view. You're probably all used to this kind of screenshot here. It's a little boring. It's like black background, white text. So there's stuff we can do. So the idea today is that we're going to try to go from this thing here to something a bit more complete. So today I'm going to show you this example application I built, which is a very simple application. It's using the GitHub API to get all the events that are happening on the Xamarin organization. And using that kind of framework, we're going to see how we can improve all of that. The default list view you have seen before. So let's build this. Okay, so we're going to split the thing in 3 parts because there is 3 kind of general aspects we can do. So the first thing to focus on is the basics. So that includes loading up the data, layouting in a good way. Then we're going to see the pretty. So how we can make this default kind of black background, white text a bit better. And then the part I'd like to call the gimmick, which is like, you can spice it up a little bit to make it even more attractive for your user. So the basics. So I'm just going to switch quick here. And I'm going to have, so I have my phone here, and I have essentially the same application in 3 different states. So we're going to see first the basic one. So let's hope the god of Wi-Fi is with me. Yes. Okay, so that's the first part of the application. So that's how it looks without any prettifying up or any animation on it. This is just the basic framework of loading up data and everything. So the first thing I want to bring your attention on is that when I loaded up the data, there was that little loading screen at the top. So every time you're loading up data, let me switch back. So every time you're loading up data from the internet to fill some kind of view, generally you always want to give an indication to the user that you're trying to load something. And that, most of the time, that passes by just showing a loading wheel like that. So with list view, when you use list fragment and list activity, a little known fact is that the default layout that SViews use is simply a giant list view inside a container. But a little known fact is that you can customize this fragment. You can customize this layout to be anything you want. And you can do something like that. So there is you can supply this kind of custom layout if you want. And there is 2 important parts here that you can use, is that there are 2 IDs. The first one is the Android list ID. So that's an ID you can apply to a list view item, and that's going to be what the list fragment or list activity display. But there is also an ID called Android empty. And that idea is very interesting because you can apply it to anything you want. What this is going to do is that when there is no data in the list view, that view is going to be displayed. And as soon as you have any data in the list, it's going to be hidden, hence the name. So it is very practical then to just use that to display your loading wheel, because as soon as you're going to get data into the list, that view is going to disappear, and you don't have to handle the state changes. So my reload button, I didn't have to do anything. I just had to clear my list view, and automatically Android is going to show my loading wheel again, because that's what I want. So that's a very simple trick to, a pain-free kind of way to show information to your user. Next, there is a very big topic when you do any kind of list view, when you do any kind of loading of data from the internet, is asynchronous loading. So generally, you start off when you have downloaded your data, so when you have gone from the loading wheel to your list view, to the list item display on the screen, generally you don't have all the information you want to display. You have some kind of, in that case, you just have, for instance, the GitHub, the name of the user, and the repository they have been working on. But generally, you want to do some other processing on the side. In my case, I want, for instance, to download the avatar picture of each of the user. So that's a processing I have to do in addition to the normal list view loading. But at the same time, I don't want to wait until I load every avatar so that I can display something to the user. So what I do is that I first display the text, and then I try to fetch the avatar of the user. But the problem when you do that is that you introduce a lag between the moment where you download your picture and it is shown on the screen. And what happens is, and the big problem that happens is due to the way that Android works with list views. When you have a list view in Android, the views that are displayed as list items are reused by the system to display something else. Typically, when the user scrolls your list view, the list items that come afterwards are actually the views from before just reused. So the situation that arises is that if you have displayed, so if you have used the view, you have created a view to display cat, and you are trying to load the image of the cat to display to the user, but then the user just scrolls very fast your list view, you're going to end up in a situation where the initial view is going to probably be reused for something entirely different. But the problem is that your callback, your distant call is still being made, and the callback is still going to be called. So you may end up in a situation where, although you are displaying something entirely different, like a dog in that case, because the request is finishing up later, you may actually update the avatar to something that is entirely different, and that's not what you want. So this kind of pattern is actually a very common concurrent programming kind of thing that always comes back. If you are familiar with the ABAP problem, it's exactly the same thing. And so these guys on the concurrent side of things, they have solved the problem by using something very simple called version number. So the trick in that case is that you can add a little value, so a little integer to each of your views that's going to tell the state in which it was processed. So the idea in that case is that every time Android requests a view to be displayed in your list view, you're going to have to increment that little integer. And just using the value, and then you're going to cache the value that you're using, and that's going to be your token. You can then use that token to pass it to your distant call. And what this is going to do is that as soon as you have finished, so there's a couple of states. I guess if you want to do it correctly, you're probably going to have some kind of cache for your images, for instance. In that kind of images, you're probably going to have some kind of cache. So the easy path is always to have that image in the cache, and then you can display it directly onto your user. So that's the perfect path. But if you don't have that image, you're going to have to download it. So here, for instance, I'm going to download, imagine I have a URL for the image. I'm just going to download it. So you want to do something later. So here I'm using the TPL, but you could use a wait if you want to. And by setting up a continuation, I can get the result back as soon as it finishes. What I'm going to do is that before I do any more action on my list item, I'm going to check that the view version number, the current view version number, is equal to the version number I had when I started it. And if it's not, you don't do anything. You just probably use that image and put it in your cache for later, but you don't show it to the user. And as you have noticed, I'm using it twice. I have the same, the exact same code in 2 times. And there is a good reason for that, is that the initial one is more, the initial line, so line 9, is more of an optimization. Because what you want to do, you don't want a clobber the main loop. Because if you have, imagine you have loaded a lot of image, and you don't check that version number change. What you're going to do is that you're going to queue up a lot of events on the main loop and totally starve it. So what this is going to do is that when the user, for instance, is scrolling at the moment, is going to see a lot of jitter because you are basically holding on the main loop for nothing. So you don't want to, you don't want to clobber the main loop by just pushing too much events. So that's why you first check that. You first check it before posting your callback onto the main loop. But then when you have posted your thing on the main loop, something might still have happened. So by the time your callback on the main loop is run, the version number might also have changed. So that's why it's also very important to check it again on the main thread. And as soon as you check it on the main thread, you're sure that nothing else could have happened that changed the list view to something else. And then you are sure that you can actually change the image to the thing you just downloaded. And if you also notice just below, I'm also taking up that opportunity to animate the image loading. So we're going to see that later, exactly how it's done. But that's a very good example of how you can provide a nice visual indication to a user by saying that, look, I just finished downloading something decent, so a long-running operation. I'm just going to animate the image view to reflect that onto your user interface. OK, so now let's go to the pretty, so how we can prettify that thing. So let's load up the second application. So again, very much the same application. The only thing I changed was just essentially take the list item I had before. So on the previous list view, I just reused the default Android list item, which is an activity item. But on this one, I'm using totally custom totally custom list item I just made. So as you can see, the usual you would expect from a list view. So some nice gradients, some nice text around, text effects on the user and the repository, et cetera, et cetera. So you're probably not a designer. Personally, I'm not. I'm really just much a coder, so anytime I have to go in Photoshop or any image editing software, I'm kind of lost in that thing. But I still want to do pretty application because we are on a pretty platform, so we want to do pretty application too. So it turns out there is something that you can use in Android which are shape drawable. Shape drawable are simply an XML file that contains very basic instruction to lay out rectangles, oval, any kind of geometric shape. And the good thing is that you can use this to make very easily and very quickly nice list item. So here I'm doing a simple rectangle. As you can see, I have a nice rounded corner, like everybody uses rounded corners these days, and a nice little gradient. So in that gradient, I'm using the gradient to essentially add more depth to my list items. So that's why the center is a little bit below the middle. And then I can just stroke the thing. So the good thing is that shape drawables are like any drawables, you can apply them anywhere. So in the case of the list item, I applied it to the background of my frame layout. But then you could also apply it to anything. And you're going to see later that I'm also reusing the shape drawable in a button, for instance. So very easy to do. OK, so this one is probably my favorite tricks I have. So I don't know if you're familiar with so I already touched on drawables. But generally, what drawables are on Android is drawables are just a general way in Android to draw something on the screen, surprisingly. So what they do is that what you can do is, so anything that you draw on the screen in Android is a drawable. Even if you have a bitmap and you had your bitmap to an image view, the bitmap is first translated into a bitmap drawable before it is actually shown on the screen. So the good news is that you can extend that facility to do anything you want on top. So the idea here is that I want to do this thing. I want to have an image that is totally raw, and I want to add rounded corner to it. So I don't know if any of you have tried to do rounded corner images before, like by code. But for those who have tried, it's generally involving custom bitmap loading, trying to kind of pixel perfect way of making rounded corner. It's just a pain in the ass. So the good thing about it, and that's not very known, is that in Android you have access to shaders. So it's a big world. It's not necessarily like a GPU shader. It's not that complicated. But then the good thing is that you can use that simply to essentially add custom processing to your painting. So what I'm doing here is that I'm taking the bitmap, so the raw bitmap you have seen before, adding into a bitmap shader. And what this is actually going to do is that it's going to take that bitmap and convert it into a texture. And then I can use that texture and put it in a custom paint. And so the idea of all of that is that when I'm going to be drawing that image onto the screen, I'm going to use that special texture to actually put my image on the screen. And the good thing is that instead of having to do custom processing on my image to add the rounded corner, I can simply use the draw rounded rectangle method that is already available in the Canvas API. I don't have to do anything on that. So it's a pretty good thing because that means you don't have to have different version of your bitmap in memory. So one that is like, for instance, the raw version and one that is the rounded corner version. That means you can also adjust the corner radius or anything you want to do, I mean, any custom processing you want to do at runtime, et cetera, et cetera. So a pretty good trick to know. And so, as I said, it is essentially a drawable. So anytime, anything you can, like an image view, for instance, but anywhere you can actually put a drawable, you can also reuse exactly the same thing you have done to add the effect. So I had a talk last night, for instance, someone asked me if it was possible to do, so in iOS, they have this nice thing where you can set a drawable onto a button, for instance. And instead, so when you have a button like that, you kind of want to have two states. You want to have an image that is the default image, and then when the user tap on the button, you want to have something that gives a way to say, oh, I've been tapped. So the way they do it in iOS is that you can just set a tint color. So what this is going to do is that it's going to reuse the whole image and just add a little tint on top. And in Android, you don't have something like that. In Android, if you want to do buttons, like custom buttons, you have to go to a stateless drawable with like, state 1, use this drawable. State 2, use that drawable. State pressed, use that drawable. So you don't have the same thing. But if you wanted to emulate exactly the same thing iOS is doing, you can exactly use the same kind of trick to just reuse your original drawable, and using that facility of bitmap shader, you can just add just a simple layer of colors on top. So the same way you would do it with a normal paint object. So that's a way, for instance, to walk around the default state list on Android. OK, so another very interesting one is insets. So if you have a Mac, or if you have used any Apple product, that's an effect that Apple loves a lot. So for instance, when you have macOS on your title bar of your window, what they do is that they first lay out the text, and then they had a little border, a 1 pixel white border just beneath it to give some kind of inset effect, so a depth. So it's a very cool effect because it's less obtrusive than using other typographic tricks like bold or italic, but still it provides a nice way to make the text stand out. And the good news is that it's very to use in Android because text view by default on Android have this thing called a shadow layer. So a shadow layer, it's exactly what it means, is that it's going to be an extra version of your text below the first one where you can set different versions, so different attributes, so including the radius of the shadow, how much you want it, translated from the original position, and of course the color. So that means you can do, so I don't know if you're going to see very well on the screens, unfortunately, but so on the first case, I'm having the same Apple version, the same thing that Apple uses. So I'm having black text with that little white background, that little white border just beneath it to make it stand out. And then you can use the opposite one if you have a dark background. So you're going to have a black border on top of your existing text. So that's a very cheap effect to have to just make some part of your list item stand out better. And if you have seen, so I don't know if you have noticed on this, but I'm using that trick essentially to make the user and the repository here stands a bit more. So on a good screen, so most of these fonts these days have really high density. So on this kind of screen, it's a very good effect essentially to have. OK, so the funny part, let's say. I call it the gimmick, but really you could just call it the animated stuff. So I first want to start this by saying that animation are kind of a double-edged sword. It should really just be used to give indication to the user. And by that, I mean that users don't come to your application because it has funny animation or beautiful 3D effects or things like that. They come to your application because the application is useful. So you don't want to, you don't want to hide all your application between, funny transition and everything. It should just be meaningful to the user. So I have that code here, and unfortunately, it's me who said that, so I don't have a big name to back it up. But what I'm going to do is that all my remaining slides, I put like the funniest, crappiest transition I could find in Keynote. So just so that you can experience exactly what I mean by, adding a bit too much animation to your slides, well, to your application. OK, so the first trick. So I hinted that before. So a very nice effect when you're loading up image is to simply have a simple fade out, fade in. So fade out of the whole image, setting up the new image, and then having it fading in. So that's an example of a nice effect, but also useful to the user. Because by using that effect, you essentially give an indication to the user that something has completed. In that case, that you downloaded the new picture. And the good news is that it's also pretty easy to do in Android. So there is a lot of ways to do that thing. It's a very simple effect. If you have been following the Xamarin blog, I already posted that trick up on there by using view animation. So view animation is the Android legacy kind of animation framework. So here I'm using the new property animation that appeared in Android 3.0. But if you want, if you're targeting an application, if your application targets older Android, you can reuse that trick with just view animation. So you can look it up on the blog if you want. So I'm going to actually show that to you. I forgot. So let's load up the last version of the application where we're going to see all of that. If the God of Wi-Fi is here with me. Yep, nice. So that's the final application. As you can see, as I'm scrolling, all the little images I have here, as they load up, have this little fade animation here to tell that it's being downloaded. But then at the same time, as soon as I have downloaded the image, so that's also, if you remember the old source code, if you already have the image in your cache, that means you're not going to start something very, if you already have the image in your cache, it's actually better in that case to just directly show the image. So that's one of the examples where you shouldn't use animation too much. If you already have the information, there is no reason to have a transition between the old state and the new state. If you have the image when your view item is being queried, just put the image directly. Okay, also a very interesting one. For those who have used the Google Plus application on Android, I don't know if you noticed, but as you scroll your news item, anytime you have a new thing that's coming up at the bottom, you have this very nice little animation that makes it pop up. So that's, again, a very good example of how to use animation to provide meaningful information. In that case, the meaningful information is that, look, that is something you haven't read yet, so you may be interested in it. So by having this subtle effect of sliding in, you can tell the user, look, you should probably look into that. So very simple to do, actually, because that's an animation that's part of the main framework and is exposed through animation utils. So the bad news is that, the good news is that this thing is available since Android 1.0. But the bad news is that it's using view animations. So you do have to be a little bit careful because you could have, if you're not careful, sometimes view animation can cause a lot of artifacts when you're using list items because list view has a kind of special way to lay out these items. So you just need to be a little bit careful on that. But in the basic case, normally this thing should work. So you probably have seen the effect already, but I'm just going to show it again to you. So anytime I have a new item coming in, as you can see here, that animation is being played. So even if I scroll a lot of items like that, they're all going to be shown with this nice little effect. Okay, so very, very interesting one too, and often underused. So if you don't know about it, layouts, any view group, so linear layouts, collection view in most recent version of Android, all of them have default animation attached to them. The only thing is that they are turned off by default. So it's a very interesting way to do animation because it's essentially pain-free. You don't have to handle it yourself. The only thing you have to do is adding items, removing items, changing, anything you change in your layout is going to be automatically animated if you turn it on. And so the good thing is that it's very easy to turn on. You can just go in your XML and add that little attribute called animate layout changes. And just by turning that on, all of your operation on view groups are going to be animated. And the good news about it is that it's also going to handle the case where, for instance, you're going to add an element to a linear layout, for instance. So as soon as you had the element, the animation is going to play. But then imagine you are removing it straight away. You don't want the animation to continue because the element is already being removed. So the good thing is that using layout and transition layout animations, that problem is going to be solved for you because Android is going to take care of canceling the old animation and playing the new animations. So very, very interesting to use. So I'm using that trick in a kind of a specific way. I'm not really using it to have like, the usual way to use that is to have collection views. For instance, in audio, you can have like albums view, and then, as you had albums, you can have this kind of nice effect playing out. But here I'm using it to have a view that has two states. So the idea here is that you're going to have your main view, so in that case, the list item, which is going to display information. So that's what I've showed. That's the default state of my view. I'm actually going to switch so that you can see. So what I have here is that my list item has, by default, what I call the presentation layer. So that's the information you see here. But the idea is that when I tap on one, for instance here, what I want to have is a set of actions. So in that case, add a comment, star the thing, or if it's a repository, in that case, fork it to somewhere. And so to do that, essentially, both of my states are just different linear layouts. And so using automatic layout transition, what you can do is that you can provide a very nice way to switch between the two. Oops. Don't touch any button. So using automatic layout transition, what you can do is that you can make this change of state very nice to the user. And the good thing is that it's very simple to do. As I said, the only thing you need to change is the parameters of your views. So the first part is when I have the action layout shown and I want to show back the presentation layout. So the only thing I have to do is that I just have to say presentation layout, please be visible, and action layout, please have a very little height so that I don't see you anymore. And when you apply these things, automatically Android is going to make the adjustment you have seen. So fading out, like pushing back the action layout and making the presentation layout appear again. And if you want to go the other way, you can just go the other way. So by setting this time presentation layout visibility to gone and putting the action layout to a proper height, so in that case, wrap content. So very simple way to do animation. You don't have to care about it at all. Very straightforward. OK, so we're almost at the end. So I just wanted to point out a last thing. For those who don't know, on Android, on the new developers.android.com website, there is a new section that recently appeared, which is called Design. And in there, there is actually a whole set of guides on how you can design better Android application with a lot of tips and tricks, like a whole library of components you can use, of visual interaction you can reuse, et cetera, et cetera. So if you haven't read that page already, I really urge you to read it because it contains a lot of interesting content. And that's it for me. So the source code of the application I just shown with all the codes, all the nice things you have seen, is available on GitHub. So feel free to reuse as much as you want. I don't think I put the license, but let's assume it's public domain. Don't repeat it. And yeah, that's all for me. Thank you. So if you have any questions.
Yeah, hey there. So when you were showing the background loading of images,
okay.
So that was kind of cool. I really liked the version number trick. I try to use the URL of the image, just check against that, but version number sounds better. But one of the questions I had is, how do you stop, say you've got 100 items in your list and you just do a massive scroll. Now all of a sudden you've got 100 things going in the background trying to load. So have you got some thoughts on how do you stop and say, just do the last 5? It should just be like a LIFO queue, last in, first out kind of pattern to get just the last, the images that you're seeing on screen, load them first, and don't worry about the ones that I've scrolled past. Or something.
So you mean like just the loading up of, loading the images themselves then?
Yeah, just like the stuff that you're doing in the background. You don't want 100 things to load before the stuff that your user's looking at shows up.
So more like on the TPL side of things, or do you do that?
Right.
Yeah. So that's actually a tricky question because TPL doesn't really have something like that. So that's one of the shortcomings of TPL is that you would have think that they would have something to essentially, exactly as you said, cancel out old items. So they don't, well, it's possible, but they don't make it that really easy. You have to handle all the cancellation yourself. So yeah, there is no, I don't have like a good straightforward way to do it, unfortunately.
Cool, thanks.
Like we can discuss strategy for that later if you want. Also, so if you are familiar with the Xamarin blog, so I already posted a couple of these tricks already there, so there is a new one in this one. But if you have any requests or anything you would like to see covered up there, you know. So.
On the activity change, the automatic animation, I noticed that you were setting the height to like 1 pixel.
Yep.
If you were just to change the view state, would it automatically run the animation, or do you actually need to physically change the size of the view for it to run the animation?
So that's just a stylistic issue. So I wanted essentially, so when you change the visibility, essentially what Android is going to do is that it's going to do an alpha animation. And when you change the size, it's just going to do a scale. Essentially, it's going to animate the size change. So in that case, I just use it essentially to have 2 sets of animations so that you can see better. But nothing prevents you from just having visibility gone for one and visibility visible for the other one. It's just a matter of taste after that.
Just a quick follow-up. Is there anywhere that it documents what animation is going to run or what the default animations are?
So apart from Fade Image View, everything I've seen here is available on all Android versions, including the bitmap shader one. I was actually surprised because when I checked up this morning, I thought it would be present in a later version, but it's actually available since API level 1. So if you have to do rounded corner, remove all the pain of doing that by bitmap and just go directly to bitmap shader. All right, well, thank you very much.